Welcome to Learning English, a daily 30-minute program from the Voice of America. I'm Pete Musto.
And I'm Dorothy Gundy. This program is aimed at English learners, so we speak a little slower and we use words and phrases especially written for people learning English.
Today on the program, you will hear stories from Anna Mateo, Brian Lynn, Bob Doty, Larry West, and Morris Joyce. But first, this report from Jill Robbins.
The United States Department of Justice announced Wednesday that a Harvard University professor and 2 Chinese nationals have been charged in connection with aiding China. Charles Lieber is head of Harvard's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department. U.S. officials say he was arrested and charged with making false statements to the Defense Department about his ties to a Chinese government program. The Justice Department claims that Lieber lied about his involvement with a program known as the 1,000 Talents Plan. It said the Chinese government and the Wuhan University of Technology, WUT, gave him more than $1.5 million to set up a laboratory and carry out research in China. In exchange, WUT gave the Harvard professor $50,000 a month and also paid for housing and other living expenses. The Justice Department also announced charges against Yan Qingye, who is currently in China. The charges include visa fraud, making false statements, and acting as an agent of a foreign government. U.S. officials arrested Zhao Shangzhong, another Chinese national, in December 2019 at Boston's Logan International Airport. He is accused of attempting to secretly transport 21 containers of biological research to China. 1 month later, he was charged with smuggling goods from the United States and making false statements. The New York Times reports there are at least 180 investigations of intellectual property theft at 71 universities and other institutions across the United States. The 1,000 Talents Foreign Experts Program is a major focus of the investigations. The Justice Department has described the plan as one of China's top talent recruitment programs. It is designed to interest and help high-level scientific researchers who would then support China's scientific development, economic growth, and national security. The charges brought by the U.S. government against Professor Lieber are extremely serious, said Harvard, in a statement to the technology website The Verge. When U.S. researchers get financial help from the government, they must tell the truth about their connections with foreign organizations. The punishment for making false statements in this situation could include up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. In the past 6 months, other university researchers have faced criminal charges for passing knowledge to China. One of them was Turab Lukman, a scientist who formerly worked at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Last week, he admitted in court to lying about his involvement with the 1,000 Talents Plan. U.S. officials said they became interested in Lukman after he told a co-worker he had citizenship in 4 countries, including India, where he was born. In December, Alan List, resigned as Chief Executive Officer and President of the H. Lee Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute in Tampa, Florida. An investigation found that List and Thomas Sellers, a vice president and director at Moffitt, and 4 of the cancer center's researchers hid their ties to a Chinese medical university. Feng Franklin Dao worked as a chemist at the University of Kansas. In August, federal officials charged him with 4 counts of fraud for working full-time for a Chinese university while receiving U.S. government money. Dao has denied the charges. His lawyer said that the case could have been a misunderstanding because of the researcher's employment in China over the summer holidays. The university says Dao is on administrative leave from his position as a professor of chemical engineering. Last month, the government announced more charges against him. Wang Nongmeng is a political commentator who lives in France. He said the Thousand Talents program had for many years tried to steal high technology from around the world. Some scholars and officials who live in a democratic system and enjoy all its freedoms will aid those who would harm it for personal gain. Wang added, Western countries should get hold of a list of those recruited to China's Thousand Talents program and investigate them one by one. I'm Jill Robbins.
Now, words and their stories from VOA Learning English. Today, we talk about a common expression made from 2 common words, stir and crazy. Put them together and you have the adjective stir crazy. Now, before we talk about stir crazy, let's talk about the words separately, starting with crazy. We use the word crazy in so many different situations. For example, one meaning of crazy is insane. If someone's behavior is really annoying you, you can say they are driving you crazy, making you lose your mind. Crazy also means in love with something or someone to an unusual, often comical degree. You can be crazy about baseball, crazy about spaghetti, or crazy about traveling. If you are crazy in this way, we might say you have lost your head. We also use the word crazy to mean an extreme level. For example, she has been crazy busy these last few days. That guy is crazy good looking. And this spaghetti is crazy good. Now the verb stir. When you stir something, you mix it up. In the kitchen, we often stir dishes like soup and cake batter. However, stir used to have another meaning. Several online dictionaries say that in the mid-1800s, stir was slang for prison. Aha! That information helps today's expression make sense. Stir crazy means you feel unhappy and upset because you have been in a place for a long time and you want to get out. Some experts say the term stir crazy dates back to the early 1900s. It was used to describe prisoners who became mentally unbalanced from being locked up. Other prisoners would say they went stir crazy. Today, we use the expression to mean stuck in any situation where we do not want to be. If you are stir-crazy, you feel restless, trapped, and bored. Now, let's hear the word used in some examples.
This class is so boring. When will it be over? I'm going stir-crazy sitting here.
The jury talked about the case in a small room with no air conditioner for 9 days. By the 10th day, everyone was stir-crazy.
When is this rain going to stop? I've been cooped up in the house with the kids all week. I'm completely stir-crazy.
That's right. Even love for those with whom you are stuck is not a fix for feeling stir-crazy. And that's Words in Their Stories. Until next time, I'm Ana Mateo.
Major nonprofit organizations are protesting the planned sale of the .org Internet registry system they belong to. The groups say the sale of the system to a private investment company could lead to much higher costs to register and keep a domain name. A domain name identifies a website on the Internet. The nonprofit groups also say the change could reduce freedoms of speech and expression. The registration process for millions of nonprofit groups using websites that end in .org is controlled by the U.S.-based Internet Society, or ISOC. But in November, the Internet Society announced it was selling control to Ethos Capital. It is a private investment company based on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Hundreds of organizations have objected to the plan. Top nonprofit groups like Greenpeace and Amnesty International have called for the $1.1 billion sale to be blocked. Last week, the directors of 10 leading nonprofit groups published an open letter during the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Switzerland. The letter urged the Internet Society and ICANN, the Internet's governing body, to intervene to stop the sale. Should the governance and stewardship of .org end up under the control of private or other actors that could lead to financial or other barriers, that would irreparably harm global civil society, the letter read. The Internet Society said in a joint statement with Ethos Capital that Ethos had promised to limit any cost increases to a yearly average of 10%. The statement added that existing agreements with ICANN contain limitations to prevent an Internet registry from selling information about registered organizations. The statement rejected suggestions that the new system would lead to spying or censorship of online material. Ethos and the Internet Society take freedom of expression very seriously, and the registry's commitment to free speech will continue unabated. Brett Solomon is the director of Access Now, a group that supports policies to keep the Internet open and free. He told Reuters the sale could force smaller organizations with less money off the Internet. In addition, he worries about the level of control handed over to the new owner of the registry system. They have a capacity to take somebody off the .org domain, which means they can censor, they can monitor, they can deny, Solomon said. And all these issues are very, very important for organizations who are challenging governments and are challenging powerful interests, he added. A small demonstration was recently held at the ICANN offices in Los Angeles to protest the planned sale. The demonstrators presented a letter signed by 35,000 supporters that urges ICANN to block the deal. ICANN's chairman, Martin Botterman, came outside with some other board members to meet with protesters. He told the Associated Press that ICANN is in the process of examining the effects of the sale. He said the organization was also looking to find guarantees to offer concerned .org registrants. I'm Brian Lynn.
Welcome to The Making of a Nation, American History in VOA Special English. Woodrow Wilson's first year as president showed the American people that they had elected a strong and effective leader. Wilson took office in 1913. He moved quickly to fulfill his campaign promises. He won congressional approval for lower import taxes, a new tax on earnings, and restrictions on the power of big companies. These were some of the most important economic reforms the nation had seen in many years. Larry West and Morris Joyce continue the story of Wilson's administration.
Most of Woodrow Wilson's political victories were on national issues. He had little experience with international issues. But foreign events soon began to demand more and more of his time. With all of his successes at home, it is a surprising fact of history that his presidency is remembered best for its foreign policy. The story of Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy is full of high ideas and political bravery, but it also is a story of fierce struggle and lost hopes. It is a story that begins across America's southern border in Mexico.
At that time, Mexico had been ruled for many years by Porfirio Diaz. As Diaz grew older, his power began to weaken. In 1911, a revolt broke out. It was led by Francisco Madero, the leader of a land reform movement. Diaz understood he could not win. He resigned and fled the country. Madero declared himself president. However, powerful groups in Mexico opposed him. In a short time, one of his own generals, Victoriano Huerta, arrested him. Madero was murdered soon after Huerta seized power. President Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's government. He believed other forces would rise up against him. Wilson was right. Another revolt began, led by General Venustiano Carranza.
Wilson offered aid to Carranza. Carranza rejected the offer. He was afraid of American interference in Mexico. He told Wilson that Mexican troops would do all the fighting. He only wanted guns and ammunition. American forces did, however, get involved in the conflict. President Wilson learned that a ship from Germany was bringing supplies to the Huerta government. The ship would land at the Mexican port of Veracruz. Wilson ordered the United States Navy to seize and occupy the port. The move started a storm of criticism in the United States and throughout Latin America.
Welcome to Learning English, a daily 30-minute program from the Voice of America. I'm Jonathan Evans.
And I'm Ashley Thompson. This program is aimed at English learners, so we speak a little slower and we use words and phrases especially written for people learning English.
Today on the program, Ashley and I will bring you stories along with Katie Weaver. Jill Robbins will bring us this week's Ask a Teacher, and later you will hear part 4 of Love of Life in American Stories. But first, United States and United Nations agencies launched a program this week to help tens of thousands of Venezuelan migrants settle in Brazil. The U.S. Agency for International Development and the UN's International Organization for Migration are leading the effort. USAID officials said the agency will provide $4 million to support the program. The money will help Venezuelan migrants get official employment, business training, and language classes. Venezuela is a Spanish-speaking nation, while Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country. About 4.6 million Venezuelans have fled the political and economic crisis in that country. Almost 900,000 have crossed the border into Brazil since 2018. The Brazilian government says they are still entering Brazil at an average rate of 500 a day. Most have continued on to other Spanish-speaking countries. But 264,000 Venezuelans have applied to stay in Brazil. As a result, social services in the Brazilian border state of Roraima have struggled to deal with immigrants. The program, supported by USAID and the IOM, will work with the Brazilian military's efforts to move Venezuelan immigrants to cities further south. Migrants will have more opportunities for sustainable work and a new life there. The program is called Economic Integration of Vulnerable Nationals from Venezuela in Brazil. John Barca, USAID Assistant Administrator for Latin America, launched the program in Brazil's capital, Brasilia. He said, "It is not a long-term answer, but provides needed help until stability returns to Venezuela." He added, "That will only happen when the illegitimate Maduro regime is no longer in power." U.S. President Donald Trump's administration supports opposition leader Juan Guaido rather than Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. USAID said it has already provided nearly $15 million to support Venezuelans in Brazil. The Trump administration lowered the number of refugees from any country it will permit to resettle in the United States in 2020 to 18,000. That is the lowest level in the history of the modern refugee program. Army Colonel Georgi Kanan oversees the border processing operation. He said since April 2019, Brazil has moved 27,222 Venezuelan refugees and migrants to southern cities. Jose Angel Perez and his family are among those refugees. Perez was an oil truck driver for state oil company PDVSA in Anaco in eastern Venezuela. He is hoping the new program will help find him work in Brazil. He said, "I need a job, so does my wife. We plan to stay. Change will not come quickly in Venezuela."
Ash that came from a Philippine volcano has become painting material for artist Janina Sanico. Sanico is 24 years old. She lives in a town near the Taal volcano in the western part of the Philippines. The volcano erupted on January 12th, releasing huge amounts of ash, steam, and rocks. By the next day, ash had blown as far away as Manila, about 100 kilometers from the volcano. Ash clouds continued to come out of Taal for many days. Sanico's backyard plants became covered in ash. She began mixing the ash with water and a sticky substance to create watercolor paint. She then used the mixture to paint images of the destruction that the small but dangerous volcano caused. Some of the paintings were of the volcano itself. Others were of animals that suffered after the eruption. One of her new paintings is called Animal Tears. Sanico said, "I was very moved by what happened in the aftermath. The animals affected, they have no way to save themselves. So that was the pain I felt." Sanico describes herself as a natural watercolor painter. This means she tries to use things from nature to create the colors that she paints with. She is especially known for using coffee in her watercolors. She said she was surprised that the ash worked as well as it did, as long as she added enough water. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homes after Taal erupted. Sanico said she has been selling her volcanic ash paintings and donating the money to help those who have been displaced. On January 26th, Philippine officials lowered the danger level for Taal volcano after 2 weeks on high alert. The move permits many of the area's displaced villagers to return home.
Many Americans will turn on their televisions or computers Sunday to watch the championship game of professional American football. In 2019, about 200 million people tuned in to the yearly sporting event called the Super Bowl. Most of these viewers probably are football fans. However, Other people watch to see the Super Bowl halftime show. The musical performance takes place during a 12-minute break in play in the middle of the game. Over the years, the halftime show has presented many kinds of music, from New Orleans jazz to Latin and Caribbean sounds to Motown, from hip-hop to hard rock to country and pop. Audiences have enjoyed legendary singers like Ella Fitzgerald and Tony Bennett. They have heard international superstars, Michael Jackson, the Rolling Stones, Madonna, and Beyoncé, and boy bands such as NSYNC and New Kids on the Block. The shows have also included non-musicians like comedy actor George Burns, Cirque du Soleil Circus, and even Olympic hockey players. You kind of tune into the Super Bowl to be surprised, says Peter O'Reilly, a top events official with the National Football League, or NFL. Game day is about moments, creating moments that pull people together and that they talk about forever. On February 3rd, the San Francisco 49ers and the Kansas City Chiefs will face each other in Super Bowl 54. The battle will take place in Miami Gardens, Florida. And when the players head inside for a mid-game rest, entertainment superstars Jennifer Lopez and Shakira will help fill the center with sound, light, and movement. Hundreds of people are involved directly and indirectly with making months of hard work into as perfect a performance as possible. Super Bowl performers are not paid for their appearance, but most artists recognize the professional value of commanding the Super Bowl's massive audience. For others, playing the halftime show is also a personal goal. Ever since I saw Diana Ross fly off into the sky at the halftime show, I dreamed of performing at the Super Bowl, Lopez said earlier this year. And now it's made even more special, not only because it's the NFL's 100th season, but also because I am performing with a fellow Latina. I can't wait to show what us girls can do on the world's biggest stage. Mark Quinzel is the NFL's top vice president of programming and productions. He says choosing performers for the show is difficult. The Super Bowl draws such a broad audience, he says, adding, who is going to do the show that is the most interesting to 200 million people? Finding big performers is not the hardest part of putting together the concert. The NFL usually decides on the stars months before the football season begins. For example, league planners have been considering the 2021 Super Bowl for several months already. The real difficulty is in organizing the show. Planners have to create performances that do not interfere with the play schedule, that avoid damaging the field, and that keep the huge audience entertained. At the same time, the needs of the entertainers must be considered. Quinzel says the planners work a lot with the performers. We want them to do a show they are comfortable with, a show the majority of the 200 million people watching will know the songs they are singing, he said. We want them doing what the audiences have never seen before. These performances are driven by the artists. Our job is to pull it all together. In 12 minutes, by the way. I'm Katie Weaver.
This week, we continue our answer to a question from Na, a university student in Vietnam. How can I improve my English listening skill? Dear Na, last time we talked about face-to-face listening and listening to get information. This week, we talk about listening to lectures or speeches. At many universities, for example, teachers talk for long periods of time in English. You also may listen to recordings in English. Here are some things you can try before, during, and after this kind of intensive listening. Imagine that you will hear a lecture about rainforests. Before you listen, think of what you already know. What kind of plants, animals, or people live in rainforests? Are they in danger? Are there any related English words that you know? These questions can help you get ready to listen. As you listen, keep your brain active by asking yourself other questions like, am I following the main points? What do I need to remember? Be sure to take notes or record the lecture so you can listen later. You will probably hear new words you do not understand. Write them down. Then listen more carefully. Does the speaker explain them? Is there a picture in the classroom or in your textbook that shows their meanings? If not, use the other words around them to guess. You can find the definitions later. Afterward, think about how much you understood. If you can, ask your teacher a question about whatever you did not understand. React to the lecture with your own ideas, even if you only do this in your notes or with a classmate. Your reaction could be, I think people should work harder to protect rainforests. You should listen to VOA News, our American Stories series, songs, movies, and other things in English every day. In time, you will understand better and better. And that's Ask a Teacher. I'm Jill Robbins.
Love of Life by Jack London, Part 4.
In the afternoon, the man came to a track. It was that of another man who did not walk, but who dragged himself on his hands and knees. The man thought it might be Bill, but he thought about it without any interest. He had no curiosity. Feeling and emotion had left him. He was no longer able to feel pain, yet the life that was in him drove him ahead. He was very tired, but it refused to die. It was because it refused to die that he still ate muskeg berries and small fish, drank his hot water, and kept a careful eye on the sick wolf. He followed the track of the other man who dragged himself along. Soon he came to the end of it. There were a few freshly cleaned bones where the grass was marked by the footprints of many wolves. He saw a moose skin bag, exactly like his own. It had been torn by sharp teeth. He picked it up, although its weight was almost too much for his weak fingers. Bill had carried it to the end. Now he would have the last laugh. He would live and carry it to the ship in the shining sea. He laughed aloud, making an inhuman sound, and the sick wolf howled with him. The man ceased suddenly. How could he laugh at Bill, if that were Bill? If those bones so pinky white and clean were Bill? He turned away. Bill had deserted him, but he would not take the gold, nor would he eat Bill's bones. Bill would have done so, however, had their situations been exchanged. He came to a pool of water. Bending over it in search of fish, he threw his head back as if he had been struck. He had caught sight of his face in the water. So awful was it that his feelings were stirred long enough to be shocked. There were 3 fish in the pool, which was too large to empty. After several attempts to catch them in his tin container, he stopped. He was afraid, because of his great weakness, that he might fall and sink into the water. It was for this reason, too, that he did not trust himself to ride down the river atop one of the many logs to be found along its banks. That day he lessened the distance between him and the ship by 3 miles. The next day he traveled only 2 miles, because he was now dragging himself on his hands and knees as Bill had done. At the end of the 5th day, the ship was still 7 miles away. He was unable to travel as much as a mile a day. However, the summer weather continued, and he continued to move toward the ship. And always the sick wolf coughed at his heels. His knees had become red meat like his feet. Although he bound them with the shirt from his back, it was a red track he left behind him on the grass and stones. Once, glancing back, he saw the wolf licking his bloody track hungrily. He saw clearly what his own end might be, unless he could kill the wolf. Then began as awful an event as has ever been told. 2 sick creatures, dragging their dying bodies across a wasteland and hunting each other's lives. Had it been a well wolf, it would not have mattered so much to the man. But the thought of feeding the mouth of that nearly dead thing was hateful. His mind had begun to wander again, and he was troubled by hallucinations. His reasonable moments grew shorter. He was awakened once from a faint sleep by a cough close to his ear. The wolf leaped back, losing its footing and falling in its weakness. It was a funny sight, but he could not laugh. Nor was he afraid. He was too far gone for that. But his mind was, for the moment, clear, and he lay and considered. The ship was no more than 4 miles away. He could see it quite well when he rubbed his eyes. He could also see the white sail of a small boat cutting the water of the shining sea. But he could never drag himself those 4 miles. He knew that, and was very calm about the fact. He knew that he could not travel another half a mile, and yet he wanted to live. It was unreasonable that he should die after all he had been through. Fate asked too much of him. And dying, he could not accept death. It was madness, perhaps. But in the very grasp of death, he refused to die. He closed his eyes and tried to keep himself calm. He struggled against the awful desire for sleep that threatened him. It was much like a sea, this deadly sleepiness. It rose and rose, mastering his entire self bit by bit. Sometimes he was almost lost, swimming through its waters with a weakening effort. Then, by some strange power of the soul, his will would strike out more strongly against it. Without movement, he lay on his back. He could hear slowly drawing nearer and nearer the sound of the sick wolf's breathing. It came closer, always closer, and he did not move. It was beside his ear. The dry tongue moved across his face. His hands struck out. Actually, he had willed them to strike out. The fingers were curved. but they closed on empty air. Quickness requires strength, and the man had not his strength. The quiet waiting of the wolf was awful. The man's waiting was no less awful. For half a day he lay without motion, fighting off sleep. He waited for the thing that was to feed upon him, and upon which he wished to feed. Sometimes the sea of sleep rose over him, and he dreamed long dreams. But always through it all, waking and dreaming, he waited for the noisy breath and the feel of the tongue. This time he did not hear the breath. He slipped slowly from some dream to feel the tongue along his hand. He waited. The teeth pressed softly, then more firmly. The wolf was using its last strength in an effort to sink its teeth into the food for which it had waited so long. But the man, too, had waited long. The hand closed on the wolf's mouth. Slowly, while the wolf struggled weakly, the other hand moved across the wolf's body. 5 minutes later, the whole weight of the man's body was on top of the wolf. The hands had not sufficient strength to grasp the wolf about the throat until it died. But the face of the man was pressed close to the throat of the wolf, and the mouth of the man was full of hair. At the end of half an hour, the man felt some warm drops of blood in his throat. It was not pleasant. It was like hot melted metal being forced into his stomach, and it was forced by his will alone. Later, the man rolled on his back and slept. There were some scientists traveling on the fishing ship Bedford. From where they stood on the ship, they could see a strange object on the shore. It was moving down the beach toward the water. They were unable to decide what it was. Being men of science, they climbed into a smaller boat and went ashore to examine it. And they saw something that was alive, but which could hardly be called a man. It was blind and did not know what it was doing. Its movements produced little effect, but still, it continued to drag itself across the ground at the rate of about 20 feet an hour. 3 weeks later, the man lay in a bed on the fishing boat. With tears streaming down his face, he told who he was and what he had experienced. He also talked without meaning about his mother and a home in California among the flowers. The days were not many after that, when he sat at table with the scientists and the ship's officers. He delighted in the sight of so much food and watched it carefully as it went into the mouths of others. With the disappearance of each mouthful, an expression of sorrow came into his eyes. He was not mad, however. He hated those men at mealtimes. He was afraid that there would not be enough food. He inquired of the cook, the cabin boy, the captain concerning the food supply. They reassured him numerous times, but he would not believe them, and went into the kitchen to see with his own eyes. It was noticed that the man was getting fat. He grew bigger with each day. The scientists shook their heads and gave their opinions on the problem. They limited the amount of food given to the man at his meals, but still his weight increased. The seamen smiled. They knew. And when the scientists decided to observe the man, they learned the reason. They saw him walk about the ship after breakfast. Like a man begging with an outstretched hand, he approached a seaman. The seaman smiled and gave him a piece of bread. He grasped it and looked at it as a greedy man looks at gold. Then he put it inside his shirt. He received similar gifts from other smiling seamen. The scientists were careful. They allowed him to continue. But they secretly examined his bed. It was lined with bread. Every inch of space was filled with bread. Yet he was not mad. He was preparing for another possible famine, that was all. He would recover from it, the scientists said. And he did, even before the Bedford sailed into San Francisco Bay.
And that's our program for today.